Alrighty, greetings, good afternoon. Welcome to our discussion, who are forced migrants from Ukraine and how they impact the economy of EU countries. My name is Hlib Vyshlinsky. I am the executive director for the Center of Economic Strategy. We are holding this event jointly with the National Bank of Ukraine and the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And today's discussion is enabled in particular by the support of the International Renaissance Foundation that has supported us with our research that is going to be presented today. Also, we are joined today by our colleagues from the National Bank who will participate in presenting the results of their work that responds to one of the questions that we have formulated in our agenda today. Today's event will be taking place in Ukrainian, but we have simultaneous interpretation into English available, so please go ahead and choose your preferred channel using the button at the bottom of your screen. I also want to point out that we are going to have rather lengthy and detailed presentations by our speakers, and we will kindly ask you all to formulate your questions in the Q&A section, where the speakers will be in a position to respond and provide any details that might interest you. Now, it is my pleasure to pass the floor for an introductory speech to Mr. Andriy Pyshnyy, the head of the National Bank of Ukraine. We are incredibly grateful to the National Bank for continuously playing a very important role in our research of the Ukrainian economy, not only from the point of view of humanitarian policy and banking oversight, but we're also being supported in better understanding the Ukrainian economy and staying abreast of all the latest developments. So, Andriy, the floor is over to you. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Thank you so much, Hlib, for the invitation. Thank you to the CES. Thanks to your guests. Thanks to the Vienna Institute for supporting this incredibly important topic for Ukraine. Migration is one of the consequences that Ukraine is having to deal with. It contributes both to short-term risks. It is obviously forced, but at the same time, it is contributing to long-term risks as well. Plus, it is quite a traumatizing topic from the point of view of the overall societal moods, because migration is disturbing and uplifting not only the Ukrainian economy, but also regions and whole areas of Ukraine. It is contributing to a feeling that Ukrainians, by migrating, by running away from the consequences of the war, from the Russian aggression, being traumatized, leaving behind their homes and damaged cities, looking for safe havens in Europe, they are forced to do it. And seeking for a response to this forced myself and the management of the National Bank to dive into the topic of migration, to look at it in more detail. We want to understand whether Ukrainians are an asset or a burden. We want to understand the consequences of migration from Ukraine for the entire European continent and for Ukraine itself. And we want to kick off an important domestic expert dialogue on what we need to do to make sure that Ukrainians come back. The migration is a fact, and we need to make sure that it does not contribute to major disturbances. We don't want to lose an entire generation. As I pointed out, we've already approached this topic. We've already studied it. Over the last couple of months, our team has been looking into the data, into the statistics, looking at expert opinions, both in Ukraine and in Europe, First of all, we focused on the European countries where the influx of Ukrainians was the most significant and where the largest numbers of Ukrainians remain for longer periods of time. I have to stress that the migration caused by the unprovoked Russian aggression and the cruel war against Ukraine is unprecedented since the Second World War. And this is a challenge, of course. This is a challenge that first seemed rather serious. It seemed to be a very serious source of fiscal load on European budgets. And here is a good opportunity to say thank you. I want to thank our European partners for standing with us, for deploying support programs for Ukrainian migrants. I want to thank you for your empathy, for your support. These are incredibly important things. I want to thank you for the financial assistance. We have assessed the short-term fiscal effect, the fiscal load on European countries as around 36, 37 billion euros. It is a significant amount, but overall around 0.2, 0.3% of the European Union's GDP. But this is when speaking in the short term. In the long term, Ukrainian presence in European Union markets, I mean labor markets, consumption markets, the consumer markets, according to our estimates and our research, and I hope in this expert community, this will be supported and a discussion will take place. So our indicators suggest that the presence of Ukrainians will contribute positively. It has compensated to a certain extent for the risk of recession. And in some countries, the presence of Ukrainians might have contributed to them being able to avoid recession. It has stimulated consumer markets. It has compensated for the lack of labor resources to meet the needs of the European Union. A gradual assimilation of our citizens is taking place. They are demonstrating mostly unique talents and abilities when it comes to being able to establish an efficient working environment and to contribute productively to whichever community they are now part of. And now, due to this, the European Central Bank is assessing that the participation of Ukrainian forced migrants will contribute to about 25 to 55% in the midterm perspective. That's how many people are going to stay. The labor force of the Eurozone, through Ukrainian participation, grew by something between 0.2 to 0.88%. That translates into something between 300,000 and 1,300,000 people. Now, in view of these figures, we can say that the quantitative indicators have to be taken into account without ignoring qualitative indicators. Ukrainian personnel, Ukrainian migrants, Ukrainian citizens in the European Union are demonstrating a high level of professionalism and great qualifications. Due to this, we are in a position to state, and our research supports this, that Ukrainians are an invaluable asset for their respective new residence economies. But an issue persists that I believe all of us need to work with, and the National Bank, to a certain degree, needs to take the lead in certain issues. But I think we also need to get the expert environment involved, and state institutions need to be involved. We all should be working towards returning Ukrainians. This should not become a lost generation. The children that, together with their mothers, are now forced to reside in Europe while their men are still defending Ukraine's independence and sovereignty and are obtaining victories, need to feel that once Ukraine is victorious, they can return and they will have somewhere to return to. Of course, the danger is in place. People are starting to assimilate into their new host societies. They begin establishing community relations. They begin formulating this new career opportunities environment. The children become encultured. They learn the language. They start forming friendships. And thus, completely new perspectives are opening up for them that are perhaps not linked to Ukraine at all. And that might be the largest risk we're dealing with. Ukraine, after we win, or perhaps even earlier than that, perhaps even not after we win. We need to start thinking about this now. We need to have a reintroduction program, a reattraction program. I had a very interesting meeting at the European Central Bank with with the employees, with the interns of the National Bank, with our youth, who, upon the invitation of the European Bank, are now studying relevant disciplines and sucking up the experience. And I have to be sincere with you. After this meeting, I had mixed feelings. First of all, I was incredibly proud for our people. They look great in that environment. You can feel their motivation. You can feel their professional level, their knowledge, their preparation, their training. You get the feeling that we're contributing the best people there. And I wanted to grab them and bring them back to Ukraine. And this brings me to the mixed feelings. And when I started talking to them about this, I got this sense and I heard in response some very specific questions. They asked me when. They asked me where. They asked me about safety risks, security risks. They asked me about job opportunities. They were talking about very practical things. And there is a very clear understanding that being there, receiving information from European mass media and following everything that's taking place here, but still living their life there, abroad, the risk is very real. It can materialize, and we may end up losing the best of the best. Which is why, for me, as the head of the National Bank of Ukraine, this is going to be one of the top priority tasks. I want to see our people coming back. As we were speaking, I made a couple of offers to them to have them coming back. I want to see them here. We need them here. Secondly, I understand that this needs to be a major item on the agenda of the National Bank of Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, the Ministry of Finance of Ukraine, the Ministry of Education, and the entire system for Ukraine's recovery perhaps needs to be subordinated to this task. So it is very difficult to overestimate your contribution and the importance of your work at the Center for Economic Strategy. Your research on working with migrants is invaluable. We need to take it into account as we formulate our specific plans, our specific timelines, our specific action plans and proposals that we then can pick to implement and for them to formulate the basis of further steps by our government. We need to see our people back. We should not leave them abroad. We've kept the fundamentals in place. We still have the banking system intact. We are very much looking at preserving the Ukrainian way of life, and we want it to be available as quickly as possible. We need them here. They should not be staying there. So in light of all this, thank you so much for your research. Thank you to the experts who are visiting us here today. Don't stop. We are very much prepared to support you. You can count on the National Bank of Ukraine, on our research basis. Jointly, we are much stronger than alone. Thank you very much for your attention and enjoy a productive conversation. Thank you so much, Andriy. It has been incredibly pleasant for us to reach out to talk to your colleagues at the National Bank. It was nice to receive the initiative of discussing our research with various government entities, and the National Bank will facilitate. We have the Ministry of Digital Transformation, for example, but we have no Ministry for Human Capital and Human Resources, and perhaps we should be thinking about establishing something like that. So let's keep working on this topic. Thank you. Thank you so much for participating in person today. I wanted to use this opportunity to make a couple of announcements. Very soon, we will be presenting another interesting piece of research that brought together not only Ukrainian experts, but also experts at the international level. We really want to make it before the 1-year anniversary of the war. And the answer that we were looking for as a result of this research, I think it answers one of the key questions formulated not only in Ukraine, but also in very, very high offices during very high discussions elsewhere. Why helping Ukraine, you're also helping the entire world. So as soon as the relevant expert outputs are ready, it's going to be a sort of a collection of very fundamental items that go to answer this question along many lines. We will return to the expert community, and we are hoping that you will also be able to continue this topic and become one of the communication channels. We see you're trusted, and we rely on you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you so much, Andriy. Thank you. All right, now I want to pass the floor to my colleague, Dariia Mykhailyshyna. Dariia worked directly with this large study that we have undertaken with support from the Renaissance Foundation. So the idea originally appeared in the summer when we saw that Ukraine lacks a clear understanding of who has left for abroad as a refugee. There was no clear understanding of the portraits of the refugees and no understanding of how to bring them back, which we cannot formulate without having a clear understanding of who has left, why they have left, and what it is that they're experiencing abroad. And thus we decided that the way to answer this question was to hold a poll, a survey. We worked with our colleagues from InfoSapiens to make sure that the survey is handled properly and organized properly. And Dariia will speak about this in more detail. I also want to point out that this is just the first wave of the study. We plan to follow it up with a second wave this spring to see if there are any changes and what the dynamics are. I also want to point out that what we're presenting now is commonly referred to by us as a preliminary, an intermediary report. It goes to show that not only the fact that there's going to be a second wave, but also to stress that we're doing this for the first time. And just as any human being, we are prone to err. So it's nice that so many people are present here today. We are very much hoping that you will take the time to look through the report, and we are very much open to receiving your feedback in terms of improvements. I will now hand the floor over to Dasha. She used to work at the CES, focused on human capital. She is still a member of our organization, but now she's an advisor, and she is writing her PhD at the Bologna University. So we thought that, but we thought that it would be very possible for her to combine the PhD and this little research of ours. All right, Dariia. So over to you. All right, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen right now. So just as Hlib has pointed out, this is a preliminary study. And I also want to point out that today I am only going to present a certain portion of the results. But if you're interested in reading about the details, and if you're interested in studying the methodology more closely, you can check out the full version of the research at our website. So the study is called Ukrainian Refugees. Who are they, where are they from, and how can they be brought back? But before we move on to who they are, where they come from, and how they can be brought back, we need to understand the quantity, the number of Ukrainians that have left the country since the start of the full-scale invasion. And this question is much more difficult than it might seem because there are many different data sources, there are many different estimates based on these sources, but still our estimates indicate, we believe that the most reliable estimate is that about 3.8 to 4.7 million Ukrainians have left for Europe, the US, and Canada, as well as other countries around the world, and around 1.5 million Ukrainians are now in Russia because they were either forcefully deported, forcefully taken away, or otherwise, for other reasons, had to go to Russia. This chart here represents the dynamics of Ukrainians leaving and coming back to Ukraine monthly. And as you see in October, in March, you can see the big difference. As you can see, the biggest numbers of people leaving fall on February, March, and April. But what's interesting is that then in the summer, we were seeing many more returnees than leavers. But then in October, when the mass attacks on energy infrastructure were launched by Russia and the corresponding blackouts followed, as you can see, a certain number of people started leaving additionally every month. And according to our estimates, it was after these attacks, some 1 to 200,000 Ukrainians might leave the country by the end of winter. So now we can move on to who these people are. So these and the following results that I'll be showing are based on the survey organized by InfoSapiens jointly with the Center of Economic Strategy upon request from the Center of Economic Strategy. And this poll goes to show that the numerically largest group of Ukrainians leaving for abroad are women in the age of 35 to 49. And this is no surprise on the one hand, since for men, leaving abroad is forbidden due to mobilization, and women in the age of 35 to 49 generally tend to have children, and one of the strongest motives for going abroad is to preserve the safety of children. When it comes to children, by the way, as you can see, the ratio is 1.07 child per one adult. So making it simple, about half of the entire migrant body is children, and then half is adults, which is perhaps untypical for refugees, the refugees that the EU saw before, because among Syrian refugees, most of them were relatively young men. So this is a new challenge for the European Union that it has perhaps not encountered before. Another interesting thing is that a very large percentage of Ukrainians leaving for abroad have higher education. 66% of Ukrainians currently abroad have received a university degree. This is much higher than the average indicator for Ukraine and for the EU. This is twice as much as the average for the EU. So this can provide these people with an advantage when it comes to job opportunities. It might be easier for them to become employed. They might possess additional skills, or they might have better command of foreign languages, etc. But there are also some negative trends with Ukrainian forced migrants. a very significant number of them have lost their income sources as a result of the war. This chart here indicates what people are able to afford. Before the war, just some 12% uh, only managed to buy food. Now that figure is 42%. 42% of Ukrainians abroad can only afford food or cannot even afford food. So their income has become quite limited. If we're talking about the geographic distribution of Ukrainians, so the regions they have left behind, this map shows the relevant percentages, how many people have left which region, and we've only reflected the Ukrainians that have left for the EU, the US, or Canada. So this does not include Ukrainians who have left for Russia. And as you can see in the Zaporizhia Oblast, some 25% of the population have left for abroad. And then for Kiev and for Kiev city and the Kiev region, it's around 20%. The lowest numbers are for Western Ukraine, no higher than 10%. And then there's also Luhansk Oblast, which probably has to do with the fact that the Lugansk Oblast was majority occupied by Russia, which makes it much more difficult for the people residing there to leave. If we look at where these people are residing now, Poland leads, followed by Germany, the Czech Republic, Italy, and then others comprise 24.5%. We know that the EU has granted Ukrainians with temporary protection status. So a Ukrainian in the EU can basically go to whichever European country they pick, and they will be provided with the right for employment, residence, access to medical services, and will have a right to education for their children. But still, EU countries still are able to implement individualized policies by, for example, extending financial assistance. And this chart here reflects what these social payouts are sufficient to cover in different countries. So in Poland, you see that 56% of the Ukrainians residing there are unable still to meet their basic needs with these payouts. At the same time, Germany is perhaps the most generous country, and 13.5% say that the payouts are sufficient for them not to feel restricted in their incomes. What's also important is that whether these payouts are conditional or unconditional, whether they are attached to certain requirements for people to be able to receive the money. And we see that most countries have certain conditions in place. In Germany, for example, you need to register at a job center, which may require you to attend interviews with potential employers or to take language courses. In Poland, what's interesting is that the largest category of payouts received by Ukrainians are payouts connected to them having children. It's the same payouts that Polish citizens receive. So they were just extended to include Ukrainians into their scope. So you need to have children to be able to receive this sort of financial support. On the next slide, we are talking about the results of the cluster analysis that we've undertaken. So before we looked at refugees in general, but now we want to focus in more detail on 4 groups that we've been able to identify as a result of cluster analysis. Excuse me, something's happening with on my screen. It froze for me, so I didn't see the slide. All right, so the first group is, we've labeled it the classic refugees. These are mostly middle-aged women with children who have left mostly for Poland. This chart represents the countries they have left for. So as you can see, 45 of them are in Poland. We've called them the classic refugees because they resemble the most your average refugee
недоукомплектовані
globally.
дуже
These
часто
people are
хто,
not
тому що вони
particularly
не
well
готувались
adapted
до
to
того, щоб
life
жити
abroad. They did
за
not
кордоном.
prepare
Вони не мають
for the
політики
reality of
місцевої,
living
вони не
there. They
знають
don't have
місцевої
friends
мови,
among the locals. They don't
вони
command the local
не були за
language.
кордоном раніше,
They might
їм
have
не
not
дуже
visited
подобається життя в країні
any foreign
перебування
country before,
рівно з
and they're
українцями.
not particularly happy
Тобто
about
вони,
their
скоріш за всі,
lifestyle at the
хотіли б
new location.
повернутися, але
So
вони
they would really like
ніколи
to
їх не
go
втратять.
back, but they are
До
choosing not
війни ці
to
люди
due to
походили
security
з
factors.
територій
Before the war,
найменш сильних
they
бойових дій,
they
але вийшли
originated
з
from
місць,
territories
де
that
завдавали ракетних
uh,
ударів Росії,
that
хотіли
were
або
not
з України,
involved
або
in
так, як
military
наша
action,
країна, або
but
там десь по
but that
Північній
were
Росії,
actively
наприклад.
attacked by Russia.
Друга
So
група,
we're
яку ми
talking about
виділили,
eastern
це
regions and central
квазітрудоємігранти.
regions. The second
Це діти
group are
старшого віку.
quasi
Тобто це може здатись трохи
labor
контрінтуїтивно,
migrants.
але тим
These
не
are
менше це
older
частина
women,
українських
which can feel a
мігрантів.
little counterintuitive,
Виїзних
but
мігрантів ще
a very
виділили.
significant
Були це
number of
робітники
Ukrainian
амбасадорів в деяких країнах,
labor
наприклад, в
migrants
Італії
were
була така
older
найбільша
women.
категорія
This was a
виїзних
big thing in
мігрантів з
Italy,
України.
for example.
І ці
Um,
люди, чому ми їх
and
називали
the reason we're
квазітрудоємігранти? Тому
calling them
що,
quasi
незважаючи на те, що безпекові
labor
питання
migrants
і безпекові
is despite the
переживання
fact that
дійсно грали
security
велику роль,
considerations played
важливу,
a
але тим не
role
менш
for
не
them,
кожен з
but
цих
at the
людей
same time,
одночасно
that is
відважився
not the
виїхати
only
за кордон.
factor that
Іншим
pushed
фактором
them
було
towards
бажання знайти
leaving.
роботу.
Another factor
І не
was their
дивно, що
desire
ці
to
люди
find
фахові,
employment.
досвідчені,
And it is no
дожили за
surprise that these
кордоном,
people are
тому що
better
вони в
adapted
частині
to
працювати в
life
країні
abroad.
перебування,
They
ймовірно, там,
are
власне, це було однією із причин їх
I
виїзду.
mean, they
Були
are
більш схильні
happy
знати
to
мову
take up
місцевої
employment.
країни, де
They
живуть, були більш
usually
схильні
have a bit
мати
of a better
родинки в країні,
command
де
of
зараз
the
живуть.
local language.
Також вони
They
були
might
більш
have
схильні бути
relatives
задоволені від
in the
практики
country,
за
and are
кордоном
generally more
так.
satisfied with their
Третя група,
lifestyle
яку ви бачите,
abroad.
це
As you can
30%,
see,
30,5% з
30.5%
цих людей,
of
вони
this group
задоволені життям в країні
are
перебування на
satisfied
10
in
тисяч
their
тобто
host
максимально
country.
задоволені.
They say it's a 10 out of
І це, в
10. They're
принципі, єдина
completely
група,
satisfied.
на
And
рішення
this
про
is basically
повернення
the
де
only group
не впливає закінчення бойових дій. Тобто вони, в
that is not
принципі,
going to be
більш
impacted by the
мотивовані
end
залишенням
of
так,
warfare
аніж,
in their decision
аніж
to
безпековими
whether to come
факторами.
back. They're motivated
І
by
вони більш
economic
схильні бути
factors
здатні до
rather than
країни, може
security
це також
factors.
не
They
є
are
дивним, тому що,
they
власне,
mostly
в заході
represent the
України є
west
відносно
of
безпечніше, тому,
Ukraine.
власне,
That part
це
of the
пов'язано ще
country
з тим,
is
що
relatively
найбільше
safer.
рішення не так сильно
So
впливає безпекові
this goes
фактори.
to explain as well that their
Третю
decision to
групу ми
move
умовно
was not
називали
impacted by
професіонали.
security factors that much.
Вони
The third group, we
називаються
labeled them
професіоналами, тому
professionals.
що вони більш
They're called this
мотивуються,
way
хотіли
because
працювати
more than
за
others,
тією
they
спеціальністю,
are
якою вони
inclined
працювали до
towards
війни. І
working
вони
in the
менш
same
готові
area
працювати не
where
за
they were
спеціальністю
employed before the
або
war.
робити
They are
певні для
less inclined
перекваліфікації.
to
Тобто при цьому
requalify and to
графіку ви
change their area
бачите,
of employment.
це третя
So
група,
this
що
chart
38%
represents
із них
over here for
не
group
готові
number
взагалі
3,
на жодні кроки для
38.1% of
пошуку
them are
роботи,
not
і тобто вони
prepared
вищі, ніж
for
ті
to take
показники
any
з
steps to
введеним для
seek
будь-якої іншої
alternative
групи.
employment, and it is a larger
Можливо,
indicator than
це
for
те,
any
що
other
вони
group.
не
Um,
готові не шукати
Perhaps the
роботу
fact that
в
they
інших,
are
якщо це не
not
робота за
ready
спеціальністю,
to seek
пов'язане
for
з
work
тим, що вони
outside of
зараз
their
мають
traditional area
відповідно
of
повні
employment
умови
is explained
перебування.
by the fact that their
Багато із цих людей
conditions are
мають
pretty comfortable at the
друзів в
moment.
країні
Many of these
перебування,
people have
і тому вони,
friends
власне,
in
як
their
мають таку
host
подушку
country,
безпеки,
and
яка
so
їм
they are able to
допомагає
boast of a
триматися на плаву,
certain
поки вони
safety
не
net
знайдуть
that
для
keeps them
себе роботу.
afloat until
Вони
they
також
find suitable
більш
employment.
схильні
They are also
отримувати
more,
допомоги,
they also
жити там в
tend to
окремому
receive
житлі,
more
наприклад, а не в
assistance
гуртожитку.
to
Якщо
live
жити з тією людиною, що
in
оцінюється
separate
системою місцевою.
accommodation, and they are more positive
Незважаючи
in
на це,
assessing
більшість із
the
них, які
locals'
готують
attitudes
повернутися до
towards
України,
them.
вони
Regardless of this, most
висунуті
of
до
them
цього.
want to come
І
back to
також цікавий
Ukraine.
момент у
They've made
третьої
up their
групи
mind about
те,
this.
що
And another interesting
вони
point
не
about this group
сконцентровані в якійсь
is
країні
that they are not
Європи,
concentrated in
більше
any
зосереджені
specific
по всій Європі.
country of Europe. They
І,
are quite
власне,
dispersed
можливо, це також пов'язано з
across
тим,
the
що вони
EU.
дуже
And
часто
this
не мають
probably has
друзів,
to
тобто
do
вони
with the fact that they might prefer to live
певну
where
країну,
they have
туди, де їх
friends.
немає
So
друзів.
they're going to
Люди з цієї
wherever
групи
they're going to
походять з
feel more
Києва,
comfortable.
Київської
And
області,
people from
а
this
також
group originate from
Харківської та
Kyiv, the Kyiv
Дніпропетровської
region,
області, тобто
Kharkiv,
це
and
або великі міста,
Dnipropetrovsk
або якби
oblasts. So they
селища з
represent
великими
either
містами,
large
тобто
cities
тому якби
or the large
зрозуміло,
city
чому вони
agglomerations.
а,
So you kind of get the
професіоналами,
idea
тобто вони могли
why they
працювати
are
на
professionals.
висококваліфікованій спеціальності.
might have been
Європейських
employed
І остання група
in
вона
high-paying
найменша. Це
jobs
ті люди,
in
які
large
виходять з
cities.
офісних
And the final
працівників,
group is the
політичних
smallest.
біженців,
It represents
але
just
тим не менш дуже
16%
важлива
of all
група,
the
тому що
refugees, but
це
nonetheless a
діти
very
зони
important
бойовиків,
group.
і це
These are
люди,
people
які
from
найбільше втратили
active
житло.
warfare areas, people
Тобто
who
вони
have lost the
були найбільш
most because
схильні,
of the
наприклад,
war.
втратити житло або
They
втратити
tend to
здоров'я,
have
доходи,
lost their
забезпечення кредитів,
accommodation,
які їх втратили,
suffered
або вони
health
набагато
losses,
активно були
and
починати
they
період
tend to have the
військового.
highest numbers when it comes to various
Також
kinds of
цікаво є те, що для цієї
assets
групи
lost.
найбільш популярною
For
країною
this
є не
group, the most
Польща, як
popular
країна
group,
продукту, а
the most
Німеччина.
popular country is not Poland,
Можливо,
but
це також
Germany.
пов'язано з тим,
Perhaps
що
this has to
Німеччина
do
надає
with the fact
більш
that
такі
Germany
високий рівень
provides
соціальних виплат,
a higher level
тому,
of
власне, люди,
social
які
support.
втратили
So people who have
доходи,
lost their
напевно,
income,
заощадження від
lost
війни,
their
це дозволяє
savings and
їм отримати
assets,
хоча б якусь
uh,
допомогу, і хоча
they
б
are able
якусь
to
відвержень
benefit
від
from this
кредиту
and to
на
receive
перший час.
a significant amount of social
Як і
support
перша
in the
група,
short
ця
term.
група не
Similar to
схильна
the
повторно
first
до
group,
життя за
this group
кордоном,
is
вони також
not
не
adapted
знають
to
мову,
living abroad. They usually
не
don't know the
мають
language. They
друзів,
usually
їм
don't
не
have any
подобається життя
friends.
за
They're
кордоном.
not
Але
particularly
тим не
happy
менш
with the
вони
fact that they're
набагато більш
abroad,
ніж інші
but
групи готові
uh,
робити кроки для
much more than
адаптації,
any other
тобто
group, they are
переїхати
ready to
роботу,
take
вчити
steps to
мову,
adapt. They are
відвідувати
ready
курси з
to seek
перекваліфікації.
employment, to
Напевно,
learn the
знову ж таки,
language, to
це пов'язано з
requalify.
тим, що у
And
них,
this
власне,
probably has
вони
to
дуже
do
багато
with the
втратили
fact
від
that they
війни,
have
і їм потрібно
lost
знайти
so
новий
much as a
спосіб
result of the war,
утримуватися.
and they feel the pressure
Але,
to
тим не
be
менше, є
employed in order to
і
sustain
якби
themselves.
позитивні
Um,
новини
there
про
is
те
also good
повернення
news
цих людей в
about
Україну.
their perspective of coming
Переважна
back to
більшість з них каже,
Ukraine.
що їм
A
набагато більше
majority
подобається
of
життя в
them
Україні, ніж за
say
кордоном.
that they
І
liked
більш того,
life in
вони
Ukraine
готові
more than
повертатися в
their
Україну
life
навіть не від
abroad,
власного
and they are
регіону, а з
prepared
приводу
to
безпеки
return
свого
to
регіону.
Ukraine,
Але
not
вони
just to
теж
their
викликали
home
певних
region, but
умов,
to a different
якщо
region. But there
є
are certain
завжди
preconditions that need to
забезпечений
be
якийсь
met.
певний рівень
They want to see
підтримки
a
з
certain
боку
level of
держави,
support
щоб вони
from
могли
the government
адаптуватися хоча б на
for
перший
them to
час.
be able to
Тут на
adapt in
графіку
the
ви
new
бачите,
location,
що
at least in the short term.
93% людей, що
93.4%,
опитували,
as you can see on
вказали,
the
що вони
chart
готові
in this
повертатися
group,
у безпечніший
say that
регіон,
they're ready to
якщо їм
return
будуть
to a
надані
safer
допомога з житлом.
region if they
І
receive assistance with
85% кажуть,
accommodation.
що вони готові
85%
повертатися в
say that they're
безпечніший
ready
регіон,
to return
якщо
to a
їм
safer
буде
region
можливість
if
швидко
they
знайти
will be
доброплачувану
able
роботу.
to
Це
quickly
насправді дуже
find a
високі цифри,
well-paid
тому
job. These are
якщо правильно
incredibly high
планується з
numbers.
державою,
So with
перспектива їх
sound
повернення
government
висока.
policy, the
І,
perspective of
власне, не
these people
дивлячись, що
coming
люди
back
також
is
змушені будуть
quite
Донецьку
high.
і
And these
Харківську
people tend to
та
represent the
Дніпропетровській
Donetsk,
області, які,
Kharkiv,
власне, і
and
були в зоні
Dnipropetrovsk
бойових дій.
regions, which have been
Якщо
impacted by
робити крок
warfare
назад і, власне,
directly.
говорити
If
про
we
те,
take a
чи готові
step
українці в
back
цілому до
and
повернення,
we speak
то
about
ми
whether
бачимо,
Ukrainians in
що, в
general are
принципі,
ready
відповідь на
to
це питання
return,
так. Але
mostly the
є
answer
декілька
to this
нюансів.
question is yes, but
Перше,
there
ми
are a
бачимо,
couple of
що найбільш
nuances.
схильні
First of all,
повертатись люди віком
as we can see, the
65
highest
років плюс.
readiness to
Це
return
попередньо
is
ми
in the
бачимо, що в
65
середньому
plus age group.
близько
As you can
50%
see,
людей
about
кажуть, які
50%
готові точно
people
бути
overall
і
say that they are
24% кажуть,
definitely
що
ready, and then
більше
another
готові, а серед людей
24%
65
say that
плюс
they're rather
показники
ready.
становлять
Among the 75
74
plus
і
group,
22%,
this
тобто
figure
набагато
is
вище.
almost 74 and
Крім
22%,
того,
a huge
те, що
difference.
люди кажуть, що вони планують
Plus,
повертатись,
when
не
people say
означає,
they
що
are
люди
planning to
повернуться
come
назавжди.
back, it doesn't mean that they
З
will
тих
return
глибинних інтерв'ю, які
permanently.
ми
Out of
проводили в
the deep
рамках
dive interviews
цього
that
проекту, там
we
також звучала думка,
had
що,
as
наприклад,
part
я
of this
готова
project,
повернутися в
we heard
Україну,
people saying
але
that
там
they are
можу побути
considering coming back to Ukraine
родиною,
only
це на певний
to
час, а
visit
так
their
я повернуся
family
за кордон.
or only
Тобто
for a
можна було
short time,
послухавши
but in the
частину
long run,
людей,
they're planning to stay
вони
abroad.
також
So we
перебувають в
may
цій
assume
категорії,
that some
тому,
of the people who have
власне,
responded yes
потрібно
fall into the
трохи
same
скептично
category. So we need to take these
ставитися
figures
до
with a
цих
pinch of
цифр.
salt, with a bit of skepticism.
І, власне, дивлячись на те, що ми можемо
And
зробити,
now,
щоб,
looking
власне,
at
вбити
what we
Economies,
can do
ми
to
наводимо графік,
convince
який
Ukrainians to
показує,
come back,
власне, які
this
фактори
chart represents the various
можуть
factors
стимулювати українців
contributing
повернутися.
to their
І ви
decision
бачите, що ми
to
тут
come back.
різними
So as
кольорами
you can see, we've
позначені фактори,
highlighted them in
пов'язані з
different
безпекою,
numbers.
фактори,
Green
пов'язані з
represents
економікою і так
security
далі.
factors, blue
І хоча, звісно,
represents
безпекові
economic
фактори
factors,
є
and
найважливішими,
obviously, while the
особливо
security
в точно
factors
закінченні
are
війни,
the
і
most
де
prominent, development, including the final ending of the war, which is a significant factor for 51.2%. Still, economic factors such as decently paid job in Ukraine, a higher standard of living in Ukraine, would also convince many people to come back. So there is still a lot of potential for government policy that would incentivize Ukrainians to come back. Also interesting is the data on when people are ready to come back. So immediately after the end of the war is the response that we received from 37.5% of Ukrainians, but many, around a quarter, are prepared to come back at various points before the war ends. We've had responses such as the spring of 2023, the autumn of 2023. So perhaps these people might be stimulated by sound economic policy. And then finally, we have also tried to calculate how many people, how many Ukrainians might come back and how many people might not come back under various scenarios. I'm probably not going to delve into the methodology. You can take the time to acquaint yourself in the full with it in the full version of the report results. We have modeled three different scenarios, which obviously will have, which produce different results on the number of Ukrainians that will come back or not. Blue is the number of Ukrainians that will stay. Green is the number of Ukrainians that will come back. So under the optimistic scenario, we hope to see 2.94 million coming back, and the minimum will be 2.24. And then something between 0.86 to 2.67 million will stay abroad. So paraphrasing, some 46 to 76% of Ukrainians will return after the war ends. What's additionally interesting, we ran the numbers for how many Ukrainians might leave the country after the war finishes, which might have to do, for example, with men who previously were not allowed to leave the country, will choose to do so and to reunite with their families that are already there. And according to our numbers, among the people who already have relatives abroad, some 100 to 745,000 Ukrainians might choose to leave. So when it comes to returning, people that are older and people with lower education tend to be more prepared to return, and it will be the younger people with better training who might choose to stay in Europe, which is bad news for the Ukrainian economy and bad news for the perspectives of post-war recovery. This is another wave of the brain drain, and this might contribute to a lack of qualified workforce for the Ukrainian economy. And our numbers indicate that the reduction in consumer demand and the loss of labor, Ukraine might lose something between 2.5 and 7.71% of GDP in a year from the fact that refugees do not return. And that's just the short-term loss. When it comes to long-term loss, we have to remember that half of these refugees are children, and when they grow up, Ukraine will obviously miss out on this huge generation, which is going to be a potential issue for the labor market and the economy at large. Now, moving on to the recommendations, we are in a position to name a number of things we think would contribute productively. So first of all, we need to cooperate with EU countries to facilitate the return of Ukrainians. A very important message for international partners should be that facilitating the return of Ukrainians is one more channel through which they can support Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery. The more Ukrainians return, the faster the recovery will be, the faster the economy will grow, and the less we will need in terms of financial assistance. So this is going to be beneficial for them. At the same time, we need to establish conditions for these people to return. If we're talking about people from active warfare areas, they will not have anywhere to return to if their house is destroyed. So we need to provide the preconditions, and we need to provide for the quick reconstruction of war-affected areas. We need to rehabilitate the infrastructure, rehabilitate the residential buildings. Some of the other studies have pointed out that infrastructure recovery is incredibly important in these contexts. And as recovery is taking place, these people from the war-affected areas can be provided additional assistance for them to find a decent place to live, find employment, and for them to be able to stay perhaps in safer regions. They might receive accommodation subsidies. They might receive assistance in finding employment. They might receive assistance through requalification, retraining programs. The EU has been funding a lot of retraining courses for Ukrainians in the EU so that they become adapted to the labor market. So I think it would be possible for them to fund, for the EU to fund such training in Ukraine. And the final point we've identified here is opening up the EU labor market to Ukrainians after the war. It might seem a little counterintuitive, but the logic here is that if a Ukrainian that is abroad right now knows that they will have the opportunity of going back to the EU if it doesn't work out for them in Ukraine, if they don't adapt themselves to Ukraine, they will be more incentivized to return to Ukraine and to try. They will not be holding on to their residence permit, even if they don't like the country they're staying in right now. If they know that there is freedom of movement, we believe this will actually incentivize Ukrainians to at least try coming back to Ukraine. Thank you so much for your attention. That concludes my
Дякую,
presentation for
Дашо.
now.
Це
Thank you so
некінченний
much,
робота, тому
Dasha.
що тут
But that does not conclude
10
your
питань і
work. We
коментарів,
already have 10
на які
Q&A
тобі
questions
доведеться
that
багато
you
чого
will have
відповідати.
to
Те,
tackle
що я хотів
a little later.
сказати,
What I wanted
на
to
ті
point out
питання,
right now,
які
as a
виникали,
general
перше, в
response
чаті є
to some of the
лінк
questions,
на
first of
самому
all, the
сайті є
chat
повний
now
звіт,
has the
там є
link
дуже багато
to the full
пояснень,
report,
зокрема на ті
which
питання,
includes a lot of
які ви ставили,
explanations,
зокрема
some of them
першопродовольчих
covering
чи
the questions
розрахунків, там
that
є
you
детальна
have
табличка,
formulated.
там є всі
It
ті
shows
цифри,
all the
які ви
numbers, all the
викладали, і
calculations, all the
там є далі
assumptions
ще
that we
описана
used. So
методика
the report
відбору
describes the
порахування
methodology
вибірки,
for
який перше два слова про
forming
точку.
the
Чудово,
representative
досвіду.
groups.
Після будь-якої
I'm going to speak
презентації у людей
about this
виникає
quickly.
питання, а яка методологія?
After every presentation, people
Тому
always
ви,
ask
Даша,
about the
правильно зробили,
methodology.
що навіть не
So,
почали
Dasha,
подробно
it's
розказувати, тому що
great
часто
that
їх
you
слухати.
didn't
А тільки
delve
потім
into it at the
починаєте
beginning.
вчитися
People
до
never listen at that
виконання
point. They only
методології.
listen after they
Місце
see the
колегам
data. So,
інфосапіенс
our colleagues from
пішли до
InfoSapiens
такого варіанту.
have arrived at the following option. So we started out with the assumption that the best way to build a representative selection of refugees abroad, excluding Russia and Belarus, that we did not include as part of the scope. It was only included into the calculation of the total number of refugees, but afterwards the scope only covered Ukrainians living in the EU, in the US and Canada. We tried to reach them through their mobile phones, and I have to say thank you to our colleagues from the National Bank of Ukraine, who have developed the banking system in such a way that internet and mobile banking is really developed. And so a mobile phone is a very strong tool that links Ukrainians to their homeland. They use this phone to authorize in mobile applications of Ukrainian banks. And so our colleagues from InfoSapiens reached an agreement with Kyivstar that controls about half of the market of mobile services in Ukraine, and their subscribers are not in any significant way different from the subscribers of other operators. So we sent out polls to a randomly selected group of their subscribers with an invitation to participate in our survey, which they took online at an InfoSapiens webpage. So this way, all Ukrainians, all the refugees that have an Ukrainian operator's SIM card inserted into a telephone so that they can receive text messages had the chance to participate in this poll. And what we saw is a very decent response rate. Also, something you're going to see in the report, Dasha didn't touch on this, but this was an important part of the cluster analysis of the segmentation of refugees. Before forming the survey form, we held deep dive interviews with refugees from different countries, which gave us a better understanding of the realities of their life, of the realities that apply to different social groups, and some of the insights, some of the quotations from these deep dive interviews are included into our report. And we very much invite you to have a close read. Right, you can continue your conversation with Dasha as part of the Q&A, but now let's move on to the presentation by our colleagues from the National Bank. They've looked at other unique data on banking transactions undertaken by Ukrainians abroad, in particular, among other things. So our colleagues wanted to answer a different question. They wanted to know what was the impact of the wave of forced migration from Ukraine on European countries' economies. I'm going to pass the floor to Olga Bondarenko, the chief economist at the Department for Economic Development and Analysis at the National Bank of Ukraine. Olga, take the floor. Floor is yours. And I also wanted to turn your attention, I'm sure we will kindly ask our colleagues from the National Bank to share the link to the results of this research. It's already been published. It's very interesting, very captivating. And you will have the opportunity to have a close look at that too. Right. Greetings. So yes, my name is Olga Bondarenko, and my presentation today will focus on our joint research with a couple of other colleagues, Inna Spivak, Olga Pogarska, Olga Tucha, where we focused on the impact that Ukrainian migrants had on their recipient countries, host countries. So despite the fact that this research focuses on money and figures, I think ultimately the most important part of it is people. We're talking about around 4.5 million Ukrainians who are now permanently residing in European countries as a result of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Every month they spend up to $2 billion supporting their host countries through private consumption, but at the same time they create a certain amount of load on the accommodation system, the financial system, social support system, creating certain challenges for their host countries. But the net fiscal effect in the long run is going to be positive because Ukrainians integrate actively into the labor market of Europe. And this is being facilitated by our cultural and geographic proximity to Europe, the presence of diaspora, and the temporary protection status. And although the results of various surveys and studies focusing on the impact of Ukrainians on host countries are quite different, the common ground is that this impact is generally positive. And according to our estimates, the amount of goods sold in 2023 in Estonia, Poland, and Lithuania is going to be significantly larger, while in Germany it's going to be 0.6% larger. Now, let's have a closer look at the results of our study. I will start with the general figures that were relevant at the time it was held. So according to the UN, in mid-November, some 7.6 million Ukrainians were abroad, a large number, 4.5 of which resided in Europe. So in view of this number of displaced people, we can be sure that this wave of migration is the largest since the Second World War. A large number of migrants in their host countries received temporary protection status, and it is owing to this that we have the understanding of where Ukrainians traveled to. The largest number were received by Poland, Germany, and the Czech Republic. Over 100,000 Ukrainians reside in Italy, Spain, and France. According to polls, migrants mostly picked countries where they know someone or countries that are geographically close to Ukraine. But obviously, macroeconomic conditions and conditions in the labor market will play a more prominent role in their choice as time goes by. And we actually heard it today from Dariia. She spoke about some of the demographic and social characteristics of the migrants, so I'm not going to dwell too much on this. According to our data, I want to point out that most of them were women with children. Many of these women fall into perfectly labor-ready ages, and a very significant number of people had higher education. So, in view of the number of the large growth of the number of people traveling, so the overall number grew in 2022 as compared to 2021. We saw a tripling between October and June. These expenses stabilized at around $2 billion. At the beginning of the war, most of these expenses were covered from previously accumulated savings. Then the withdrawals dropped by about 40% due to people receiving social support in their host countries and due to the imposition of restrictions by the National Bank of Ukraine. So the largest amounts of cash were withdrawn in Poland that received the largest number of Ukrainians, but was also a large hub through which Ukrainians traveled further to the west. At the same time, we need to point out the large cash withdrawals in other countries that have a common border with Ukraine. Slovakia stands out, where this did not correspond to large expenses in retail networks, and also Romania. Ukrainians made a lot of payments in retail networks using Ukrainian bank cards. The largest volumes of these expenses fall on Poland and Germany. And despite the fact that the volumes of these expenses fell from their maximum indicator in May, they have stabilized in August and September at around $560 million monthly. Some other sources for expenses of Ukrainians were covered by cash they took out of Ukraine with them, as well as government support and labor income. And after people find employment in their host countries, obviously they will pay more and more from their incomes. So these expenses are quite a positive factor for the development of the host country economies. Crédit Agricole, for example, looked at retail sales in Poland and denoted a significant growth in categories such as shoes, clothes, hardware, electronics, gadgets. And based on this, the bank arrived at the conclusion that it was Ukrainian migrants that were contributing to a speeding up of retail in Poland over the period. In specific countries, in Poland and Estonia, in the aggregated data seen on the chart on the left, you can see this significant tick up, but it reduced then by around June. So they stabilized at around the same level as before the war. In other countries, the impact on retail by Ukrainian migrants was insignificant, either due to their relatively modest numbers as compared to the permanent population or to the high cost of living. There are various estimates of the impact that Ukrainian migrants have had on their host countries' economies, but all of these estimates arrive at the conclusion that the impact is positive. Our figures suggest that with the Ukrainian migrants' contribution, the production of goods in Estonia, Poland, and the Czech Republic is going to be somewhere between 2 and 2.2% larger. In Germany, it's going to see a 0.6% growth. This is the chart on your right. We used data from various sources in our calculations, as well as certain assumptions about Ukrainians' participation in the labor market. But there are not only positive factors, there are some challenges that have to do with the influx of Ukrainians. The Ukrainians' spending must have contributed to inflation in the EU, specifically when it comes, for example, to real estate, despite the fact that only 25% of Ukrainians were able to independently rent accommodation. Still, in the cities where they were present, rental prices have grown. We've seen very significant growth in Estonia, Poland, and Germany, and perhaps some of the largest challenge has to do with the financial burden on the budget. So the IMF has estimated that the additional burden is around 37 billion euros, which is up to 0.23% of the EU's GDP. This assumes that the average expense on a single migrant is going to be around 11.5 thousand euros, but this figure is very fluid. Different researchers assume very different average expenses, which results in very different ultimate figures. The biggest burden will fall on countries neighboring to Ukraine and the Baltic countries. Latvia can end up spending up to 9% of its GDP to adapt Ukrainian migrants. Estonia comes second, and then the Czech Republic and Hungary follow them. At the same time, the German World Economy Institute in Kiel has much more modest figures. They believe that no more than 1% of GDP will be spent by most countries, and only Poland, Estonia, and the Czech Republic will have to spend more. So in the short term, this fiscal burden might turn out both higher and lower than the available estimates. On the one hand, the lower number of bureaucratic procedures as compared to previous migration waves, the additional involvement of private players, the quicker adaptation of Ukrainians to the labor market might all contribute to reduced expenses. But at the same time, the demographic structure of the migration force, so to speak, is very different from previous migration waves. So expenses on adapting children, on providing healthcare to them might be much higher. In Poland, primary education might require an additional 2.2 billion euros, or 34 hundredths of their GDP. And then another significant amount will be required to provide healthcare to Ukrainians. We're looking at 0.23% of Poland's GDP. But the net fiscal effect is probably going to be positive because Ukrainians actively integrate into the labor market. And a very bright example here is the estimation done by the experts at the Center for Migration of the Warsaw University. Since the beginning of the full-scale war, Ukrainians have already paid over 10 billion zloty in taxes in Poland, which significantly overcomes the amount of fiscal assistance provided. There are fresher estimates by the Polish Development Fund for 2023. They believe that taxes paid by Ukrainians will exceed the amount of aid provided to them by 1.1 billion zloty. So the integration of forced migrants into labor markets will be facilitated by Ukraine's cultural proximity, by the presence of a diaspora, and by the provision of temporary protection status. People who can move around freely and get employed freely under the temporary protection mechanism will rather rather act as economic migrants and will generate added value over time. But if migrants, after undergoing certain adaptation, return to their original country, to Ukraine, the effect on the economy might be negative, considering that the initial investment is not compensated by the fact that these people then work for the economy. The integration process is quite difficult. It may require lengthy periods of time, and limiting factors here include the language barrier, the difficulty of getting a child enrolled into an educational institution, the non-correspondence of qualifications, and the need to prove them and to certify them. Many host countries at the same time implement quite active measures in the labor market, such as language courses. They provide support to employment. They provide training and education opportunities for adults. And so the OECD has calculated that the labor force of all European Union countries in total can grow by 0.5% by the end of 2022, and the largest growth is expected in the Czech Republic, Poland, Estonia, 2.2, 2.1, and 1.9%, respectively. This is twice as much as during the previous migrant wave over 2014-2017. Employment growth can reach up to 0.4%. At the same time, the European Central Bank provides a more conservative estimate. They believe that overall growth will be between 0.2 and 0.8% in the medium term, and the participation of Ukrainians will range between a rather low 25% to a rather high 55%. At the same time, considering the need for labor in countries where migrants reside at the moment, the negative impact on the employment of the permanent population or on their wages is going to be rather unlikely. But despite these rather optimistic perspectives and estimations for host countries, the data so far suggests that Ukrainians are being only moderately integrated into the labor force. In Germany, fewer than 10% have found employment. In Spain, it's 13%. In France, it's around 15%. Overall, if you look at UN survey results, although 63% of Ukrainians worked before the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, as of September, only 28% of them were able to find employment abroad. But in Poland, the figures are much better. For example, if 1.2 million migrants received social insurance numbers, about half of them have already found employment. The head of the Polish Development Fund provided his estimates for 2023, and he believes, for example, that some 60 to 70% of Ukrainian refugees have found employment in Poland, but they worked mostly in sectors with lower wages, such as logistics, industry, agriculture, construction, or the hotel business. And although many of our migrants were more qualified and were able to find better employment. So summarizing this survey, we can say that despite the primary challenges for host countries, sorry, I'm losing it here a little, host countries that receive Ukrainian migrants, the benefits for their economy are going to outweigh these challenges in the mid to long term due to the Ukrainians' integration into the economy and society at large. That will be it from me for now. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Olga. It seems to be a very interesting study that I've read with great interest, and it was nice to see it presented like this. And now we are, moving on. after two large presentations, perhaps some of our participants have questions that need to be formulated in speaking, so to speak. But I would very much suggest that if you have any questions to the National Bank's study, please go ahead to formulate them in the Q&A section or the chat. I'm sure there might be technical questions, which certainly are better answered in writing. Myself and Dasha have handled about 15 questions over the last 20 minutes, and I'm sure colleagues will be able to handle more. And we'll have some time reserved at the end of the event for an additional discussion. Now we will be kicking off partially the discussion of these two studies, and overall we'll be discussing the topic of what Ukraine needs to do in order to bring its forced migrants back. So before I pass the floor to the first participant of our discussion section, to Mr. Oleksii Sobolev, who is Deputy Minister for Economy, I would kindly ask Dasha to share the slide with our recommendations so that it's a bit of a cheat sheet for Oleksii, so that it's easier for him to respond to what we have proposed based on our study. Dasha, if we could have that final slide on the screen. Yes, Dasha is going to share the final slide. Here it is, the slide with the recommendations. And now, Oleksii, so here you see the 5 bullet points that we arrived at as a result of analyzing international experiences and based on the survey that we had with the Ukrainian refugees. As you can see, a number of overall directions have been crystallized. Some of them fall pretty much squarely within the sphere of responsibility of the Ministry of Economy, specifically the recovery of residences and infrastructure, and the recovery of employment, support in searching for employment in safer regions, retraining courses and opportunities, and also the idea of opening up the labor market of European countries to Ukrainians so that people don't fear losing their employment opportunities in the EU. Also, based on what Dasha touched on, our estimates, there are quite significant actual losses resulting from the fact that Ukrainians have been forced to leave, and there are some estimated future losses. Our colleagues from the National Bank have reflected these losses in the sense that they've spoken of what host countries will receive, what sort of benefits host countries will obtain. So my question is, how do we see the impact on Ukraine's economy? What threats are there for Ukraine's further economic development? And what is it that the Ministry of Economy can do to stimulate Ukrainians to return from abroad, both right now and after Ukraine wins in the war? So, Oleksii, over to you. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. So let's speak briefly about the Ministry of Economy's view of this whole situation. So according to our estimates, the number of people employed in the age of 18 to 60 is around 12 million people. So 3.6 million people have exited, so to speak, the production process, as we refer to it. Part of these countries, part of these people remain in Ukraine and are just unemployed. Some of them have left and have not returned. Some of those who have left continue working remotely because they are employed in the IT sector and other remote work prone sectors, and thus their contribution they still make their contribution into the GDP of Ukraine. So there's this issue of estimates. Now, speaking about unemployment in 2022, we saw 2.6 people, and in 2023 we saw 1.7. So about a million. It must be the other way around. 1.7 in 2022, 2.6 in 2023. So we've seen a growth in the number of unemployed people. We have our macroeconomic forecasts, and after the victory, we estimate that 3 million people will return in the first year, then 1.5 in the second, and then in the third year, we'll see maybe 750,000 return. And thus, we will see a 75% return of those who have been forced to flee. These are the estimates that we use in our macroeconomic forecasts. These are not facts, these are not expectations, but these are rather assumptions that we use in a technical way to continue providing our economic forecasts. What we know is that each 100,000 people who choose not to return to Ukraine and choose not to become employed reduce the amount of forecast GDP by 0.1%. So you can run the numbers from there. This is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for every 0.1%. And GDP can be measured in numbers of people very easily. So if the economy grows by 2%, you can run the numbers, you know. The Ministry of Economy, in a certain way, is supporting the growth of the economy. This is our task. We have to make it so that it grows. It can grow through the application of economic policy, or it can grow through people coming back physically. And that will contribute to the same effect. So that is the scale of the issue. And I'm just saying this to explain just how important this is. So our key priority right now is to establish conditions so that people are incentivized to come back, so that people experience the sort of dignified employment, so that they come back into a country that they want to live in. Because, as was pointed out by the research, many of them left for reasons that are not exclusively security-based. Can we have this slide of yours back on screen? And I'll happily comment on it. Yes, just give me a moment, please. So, essentially, many of these recommendations are either already in place, we're working on them, or at least we share your vision. So rapid post-war recovery, I mean, that is perhaps something to be taken up with the Ministry of Infrastructure and Communities Development. But at the same time, we are working on reinforcing the public procurement system so that it's transparent and so that it enables large-scale investment through domestic and international procurement procedures. Also, cooperating with EU countries to facilitate the return of Ukrainians. This is an obvious, necessary step. Everyone is very cautious about it at the moment, but ultimately we'll need to get it done. Providing assistance to people from war-affected regions, we already see programs implemented. We had Є робота, Є employment, Є допомога, Є assistance, and we're in conversation with our Western partners to see them significantly increase support to these programs. Mostly they are aimed at establishing new employment opportunities, new jobs, and supporting small and medium enterprises. So the programs are designed in such a way that people receive the grants to start businesses. And our main hypothesis is that this is sort of the future of Ukraine. This will ensure a sustainable level of Ukrainian development in the post-war period. Millions of small and medium enterprises that are quick to adapt and thus ensure the sustainability of the economy. Support in searching for jobs in a safer region, retraining courses. I mean, the way we look at this is rather through the lens of deregulation, simplifying all mechanisms for business, allowing for all documents to be digitalized, so that everything is simpler, so that everything is integrated, so that we are in line with EU requirements. This is still the ongoing large decentralization project that the ministry is still pushing forward, and we are being supported by the CES in doing it, so I'm sure we will continue doing so. We want to make sure that this flexibility for a person to try their hand at one business or another business, to find employment here or there, remains and is enlarged. Also, we were looking at this, but a different deputy is responsible for this, Ms. Tatiana Berezhna. We're looking at these retraining courses, national programs that will allow people to be more flexible in the labor market without reducing the options for social protection, because people are experiencing difficulties now and they need to be supported. But at the same time, we also need to give a leg up to those who want to find a new job, who want to obtain a new qualification. So opening up the EU market for Ukrainians after the war, I think this is the most politically delicate issue at the moment. Because let's have a look at this demographically. We very clearly know that after the war, Ukraine is going to have to deal with a large demographic crisis. Well, it's already here, but we're sort of ignoring it right now. But when the war ends and people come back in 2023, the birth rate for Ukraine is forecast at 0.8 children per woman. Whereas the reproduction rate is 2.2. So we are looking at losing population, at a very aging population as well. In the long run, we will see a reduction in the population, which will hamper Ukraine's chances at growing rapidly. So liberalizing work in the EU that will additionally contribute to brain drain is going to be a politically sensitive issue. I'm not sure anyone at the moment is ready to speak firmly on this topic. So yeah, entrepreneurial freedom, new employment opportunities, rapid recovery, transparent recovery. I mean, these are some of the key bullet points from our point of view. I think what we need to focus our attention on in the first place is that the recovery that will start is going to become a massive undertaking for Ukraine. And I very much doubt, well, there are estimates that it will start gradually, even several $1 billion that will enter the Ukrainian economy, let's say $5 billion. If you look at it historically, one of the top years, this will make this, whichever year when this happens, one of the top years in attracting foreign investment into Ukraine. If we reach the figure of 10 billion, that might be the best year ever. So what I'm saying is that the needs in terms of funding to provide people with dignified level, a standard of living, the need is in the range of hundreds of billions. So any such effort, any such international effort to reconstruct Ukraine is going to have a huge impact at the macroeconomic level here in the country. And I think it is going to be unequivocally the largest factor pushing people to come back, because we will be lacking the workforce, we will be lacking labor to really to process the amount of funding that will be coming into the country. So that's how I see it. Right. Thank you so much, Oleksii. Essentially, what you mentioned in your final comment when it comes to investment, that was the idea of our final bullet point, of our final recommendation. We wanted to say that Ukrainians should not be fearful of returning from the EU into Ukraine. They need to have the assurances that if they don't like it here, they can go back to the EU and find employment there. This experience is in place was in place in the Baltic countries, for example, after they became full-fledged members and the EU labor market was opened up to them. Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians actually started more actively returning to their home countries, knowing that they will not be bound to them forever. Right, now I want to invite Ella Libanova to speak. She is the head of the Institute for Demography and Social Studies at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. She knows the most, I guess, about the Ukrainian society. We have shared some of the results of our study with you preliminarily, and we've held a discussion previously. So what is your overall vision of the situation with refugees, their structure, their expectations, and what can the government do to help them? No, thank you so much. I will start, I think, with the demographic situation because 0.8 birth rate is our forecast, but it is still the optimistic version. And I have to tell you, I would be delighted if the birth rate in 2023 is going to be 0.8. I fear it's going to be lower because the war continues. And in fact, this is a huge risk, and I share the concerns voiced by the Ministry of Economy representative in terms of opening access to EU markets. I know what happened in Lithuania and Estonia. About half of their young population left. In Latvia, it was different, but in Lithuania and Estonia, about half of the entire population left. And this adds one more thing. There's one more thing. It is younger people who leave, older people who stay. They need to receive their pensions from somewhere. They need to, their social services, their medical support needs to be funded by something or someone. This is a dangerous, a risky step. It is not just politically sensitive, but I also think that these matters need to be calculated from a demographic consequences point of view. Yeah, the advantages might be much more restricted than the negatives. The people who will find employment that will satisfy them now and satisfy them abroad in the future, I'm very fearful that they are not going to return. And the problem is with the most qualified refugees, feminine, and with those who have children sort of around the high school or college age, because it is not every mother that will agree to leave her child abroad. And if the child's there and if they're studying there, I mean, the factor of having a foreign education, specifically if we're talking about Germany, it is not just a ticket into the labor market. It is a privilege ticket. And we need to be very much aware of that. Another thing that, well, I wouldn't say alarms me, but I would be very careful with this. You accentuated on you stressed the recovery of war-affected regions. As a matter of fact, the situation is much more difficult because we will have to have some enterprises of strategic importance that traditionally used to be located in the southeast part of the country. Some of them might need to be relocated, permanently relocated, and they will need to be relocated into areas that have relatively not been impacted by warfare. And taking into account the very limited capacity, ecological capacity in Western areas, in our regional policy, we need to have a closer look at the potential of the central areas. Because we may try, well, I wouldn't say relocate. I'm not saying that we need to have a gray area, a buffer zone near the border, but we still need to be thinking about mitigating further aggressive steps. Our neighbor is not going to magically vanish in either a year or in 50 years, and we need to prepare. So that's the second thing in terms of the recommendation. The third thing that I am concerned about is that even if new employment opportunities, new jobs are established very quickly in the recovery process, huge structural unemployment is going to be pretty much unavoidable, even structural. And I'm not sure how this can be tackled and what can be done. Even, I mean, at least for the first year or two, there's going to be an obvious demand for construction workers, right? Various specializations. There's always been an issue with them for Ukraine. We never had a great deal of stock. Where we're going to find them is quite unclear. Involving foreigners for these works might work as a result in terms of supporting economic recovery, but this will not stimulate returnees. And let us not forget that there's one more additional risk. You sort of touched on it in the pessimistic option. So it has to do with families reuniting outside Ukraine. So, in addition to qualified young women, we will also lose our young, qualified, similarly entrepreneurial, energetic men. That is an issue. I unfortunately didn't get the opportunity to see the National Bank study, and I couldn't join early enough to talk about it, so I'm not in a position to comment. But in terms of reflecting on your study, there are a few things that alarm me in terms of the statistics. I think we need to try to construct and engineer a common communication field, an information field. We need to bring together all the information sources and all the various mouthpieces. I told you that we were monitoring data provided by the state border guard service, and the difference in migration, the delta, is 1,800,000 within a few months, and we need to understand where the difference come from. You said that in the first days, not everyone was registered. They did register everyone. Up until the 9th of March, there were about between 100 and 200,000 people a day. Everyone did get registered. So over 10%, thinking that over 10% left illegally, I mean, that's unlikely. Our borders are guarded very decently, and there is order at the border. So perhaps we need to be looking into the picture. We might be overestimating it, or we might be underestimating it, and a lot depends on what the right answer is. Moving on to higher levels of education, I mean, there can be no doubt, simply because the majority of people abroad are from Kharkiv and Kyiv. The average level of education is higher there. I have some I have some doubts about the high level of representation for Zaporizhia Oblast. This might have to do with the fact that you relied on Kyivstar provided data, and Kyivstar is a more popular operator in the Zaporizhia Oblast. Let's think about how we can unite our efforts, how we can formulate a coherent communication strategy about this. We need to have this coordinated task force, so to speak. And when we talk about migrants, there is one more issue. It has to do with domestic migration. People today are concentrated in regions where employment opportunities are limited and are going to stay limited after the war. These territories, Western territories, were traditionally saw a profit of labor. For as much as I can remember myself, we were always talking about this. So we need to think. We need to try and think about how these people can be relocated to where they can find employment. We cannot replicate our own experience from 2014, 2015. It was very unsuccessful in terms of adapting these people. We cannot repeat the experience of Abkhazia, where people left their hometowns and ended up in these ghost towns. We don't have the people to be able to waste them like this. We should be utilizing them better. And it's very risky from the point of view of social and criminal risks. So I would very much want us to try and discuss recommendations for returning. No, returning is a bad word. For relocating all refugees from the war, both domestic and external, because I believe this needs to be an issue that we consider comprehensively. I know that a very large number of people have left for abroad from Western countries, Western regions, but they've left sort of utilizing the opportunity, and they're not actually refugees from the war. They've just used the opportunity to legally move to Poland and to have legal employment opportunities. And I believe, maybe I'm going to repeat myself. I think the key direction for resolving, addressing the migration issue is having a balanced territorial development policy in Ukraine. That's pretty much everything I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. We will obviously have food for thought for our conversations with the Ministry of Economy. And then speaking last, we agreed that Sergiy Nikolaychuk will go last. I'm sure that Sergiy will have ideas for how we can work all together further with this data. And now I want to pass the floor to our compatriot representing our international partner, the Vienna Institute for International Economy. This is a leading think tank and research center that focuses on studying the economies of countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And it is perhaps one of the strongest institutions in this area. Maryna Tverdostup is an economist at the Vienna Institute. So Maryna, over to you. Your institution has tackled these issues, I'm sure, since the 90s and then through the 2000s. I'm sure you focused on refugees from the former Yugoslavia, and you're following the situation in the Ukrainian economy right now and the impact of the refugees on European economies. So what is your vision of the situation? Go ahead. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. So speaking about the specifics of our institute, studying the integration of refugees is one of the key areas of activity for us over the last 20 years. And I mean, I haven't been involved in studies working with Ukraine for many years, but now I got this opportunity to look more deeply into the issue of the integration of Ukrainians. So before this, I worked for many years on the matter of integrating refugees from the previous wave, from Syria, Afghanistan, and the Middle East. And so I guess we sort of have quite an established framework that we can use to consider the integration of Ukrainians as they compare to the previous wave. And so now this is still a work in progress. We are still elaborating the main report. And we are starting a new project to study in more detail the integration of Ukrainians in Austria. But the main point of view from the EU when it comes to Ukrainian refugees is that they are viewed as a great potential, a great opportunity for Europe in the context of a lack of qualified labor. I have followed two very interesting presentations. And so I see that from the point of view of European countries, I support the optimistic side of the dialogue. Yes, in the short term, Ukrainians may be, to a certain extent, a burden, if the use of this word is justified, although I believe it's a little too harsh, especially for the social systems of the European countries, such as Austria, where Ukrainian refugees currently receive a broad spectrum of assistance. They receive financial support, they foresee monthly payments, they foresee free insurance, medical support, additional services. Ukrainians receive unlimited access to education free of charge, preschool, schooling. Essentially, there's a very broad spectrum. So yes, this does appear to be a burden on the social system. Not all European Union countries are as generous and as Austria, and so countries with relatively lower average income levels, such as Eastern European countries, the Baltic countries, the social support package for Ukrainians is quite a little bit more limited. But still, things such as medical insurance are provided. So everything, the bare minimum that is foreseen by the temporary protection directive, are ensured. So in the short term, of course, this does create a certain amount of pressure on the social system, on the national budget. But then, taking into account the fact that Ukrainians you need to take into account the factor that us, as the researchers here at the institution, we try to formulate certain assumptions, we try to provide forecasts, but this is not a situation that you can forecast easily, because we don't know what the duration of the war is going to be, what its ultimate outcomes are going to be for the Ukrainian economy, for the Ukrainian infrastructure system, and there is not much that we can say with certainty at the moment about the returns of Ukrainian refugees, because the forecasts are quite unstable. They are fluid and they change in view of pretty much every single event that takes place at the front lines. In the way the communication takes place, Ukrainians are viewed through a mid-term perspective prism. Even if the war ends this year, Europeans believe that Ukrainians will start leaving for Ukraine not immediately, but maybe a year or two afterwards. So at the level of political decision making, you cannot see that Ukrainians are sort of being shoved out. Rather, the conversation is that the Ukrainians are here to stay, at least in the midterm perspective. So they will be around for at least a year or two. So here we can take into account the experience of the Yugoslav war. So pretty much identical temporary protection was activated in response to the war in Yugoslavia. And in comparison with the Ukrainian wave, of course, it was not that large. The number was lower, but they stayed, the people from the former Yugoslav republics stayed until pretty much until temporary protection was in place. Some of them then were forced to leave when the status expired, but even those who found pretty much decent employment in Germany and Austria, then returned, over a period of 10 years after the war. So it's a protracted process, and one that is governed by the speed of the country's economic recovery, by opportunities in the labor market, and a lot of factors both in the recipient country and the temporary host country. So in view of so in the political discussions, it is stipulated that Ukrainians need to be receiving this minimum support package, but additional steps need to be taken to ensure their integration into the European market. It's not just about them finding any sort of employment, any sort of job. And I mean, cases of Ukrainians getting exploited, Ukrainians working in very unacceptable working conditions are quite widespread here. Unfortunately, I mean, this happens in pretty much every European country. But even those, even if we look at those who get employed illegally, this is not just about them getting employed legally afterwards for the benefit of the host country. This is the ultimate goal, is to make sure that Ukrainians are employed in a way that properly uses them as a human resource, that their skills and talents are used to the full. So it is not just about finding some sort of minimum bare employment, marginal employment. This is about seeing them fully integrated into the labor market. I can assure you that all of this is being very well understood, that this is being discussed in high-level political circles in Europe, and what we've seen from the most recent news when it comes to the policy of integrating Ukrainians into European labor market, the formulations now is that Ukrainians don't need to be supported to find any job, which is relatively easy to do. If you speak English, although this doesn't really apply to Austria, where you need to speak German, but still in places like Estonia, the Baltic countries, many people find employment because the combination of English and Ukrainian opens up a lot of employment opportunities. It's pretty easy to get employed. Even pretty much the same in the UK, the same in Denmark. So commanding the English language is a big step up. I was speaking to the representative of the Lower Austrian Employment Center. They are stating that levels of unemployment among Ukrainians are very high due to the language barrier. So political decisions come down pretty much to what the EU needs to do to maybe provide additional training, additional education. So what they can do in terms of professional development opportunities, retraining opportunities, opportunities for Ukrainians to gain additional skills. And of course, a lot of attention is focused on language courses, which are quite relevant also for English-speaking countries. So from the point of view of the political discourse, I can say that you cannot be certain that the European Union is unequivocally interested in seeing Ukrainians go back to Ukraine. Certain Ukrainians, the most educated ones, the youngest ones, those that make up the majority of Ukrainian refugees with their children, Europe would be interested in retaining them. There is the risk, therefore, that after the war ends, this bilateral dialogue about Ukrainians returning to Ukraine will not be straightforward, will not be very easy. I insist that it needs to be a bilateral conversation, so the EU and Ukraine need to align. The worst case scenario is that when European Union countries try to retain the Ukrainian labor force and Ukraine will try to compete with them, this is going to contribute to a serious conflict. But this is not improbable. This is possible. In view of the lack of workforce, some 7 or 8 years ago, if you saw the list of, deficit jobs in the EU, it used to be limited to about a dozen, and now you see hundreds of them. And Ukrainians are very much able to contribute productively to filling them in, specifically in the medical sector. A lot of people with a medical background are now migrating. So this can happen. So when we are running our research, we obviously have to consider the entire spectrum of outcomes, but now it is difficult to speak with any certainty because the fundamental factor impacting the further development of the situation is how long the war lasts and how it ultimately is resolved. Of course, we believe that Ukraine is going to win. It is a baseline assumption for us, but beyond that, it's very difficult to make any grounded predictions. Right, that's it from me. Thank you. Thank you, Maryna, for a very insightful, let me say it in English, presentation and intervention in this discussion. It's very interesting to consider this, even at the level of a single country, Austria. In the Q&A, we actually have a very interesting question. So the country that leads in terms of the number of Ukrainian forced migrants is Poland, obviously. Poland is a bit of a separate story itself, and our colleagues from the Polish Economic Institute have formulated a question that perhaps we won't be able to respond to within the 10 minutes that we have left, but it's still a key issue. So in the country where Ukrainians don't know the language, they're unable to get employed at the level that corresponds to their high qualifications, but then at the same time, employers also fear that Ukrainians might want to go back to their country. They're not labor migrants, but rather forced migrants, refugees. And so there's this whole difficulty of, Ukrainians perhaps wanting to go back to their own country, but it's unclear how long they will be forced to stay in their host country. If it's Germany, for example, if we look at the research, there's a very clear policy on language training, employment, labor market adaptation. There's a standard standard procedure for people to be put into the labor market, then for Poland, that has never had to deal with the refugee influx before, does not have this sort of policy in place. And it is therefore developing purely in line with free economy principles. The government does not really impact the picture that much. All right, now I want to pass the floor for a concluding statement. And then Dasha, please get ready to conclude entirely, to say a couple of words about how we're going to address the comments and feedback that we have heard here, and also how we're going to tackle our work over the next couple of months. So now for the final contentful comment, I want to invite Sergiy Nikolaychuk, Deputy Director of the National Bank of Ukraine, who works with studying various factors impacting the development of Ukraine's economy over the last 20 plus years. So, Sergiy, what is your vision following up from all the conversations today? Thank you so much, Hlib. I would like to use this opportunity to thank you so much for organizing this event and for moderating this event. I want to say thank you to everyone involved in the two studies presented today, as well as to the speakers of the discussion section. I feel it has been very interesting, very relevant. We all understand that the forced migration we are analyzing right now is, on the one hand, the outcome of the horrible war, but it's also a factor in its own that will contribute to the demographic situation in Ukraine for many years to come and will have an effect on the economy of Ukraine. And the further development of events depends on a lot of different factors. Some of them do not depend on what the Ukrainian government will do. Some of them are very clearly impacted by what the Ukrainian government will do. And I think we all need to devote a lot of effort to deeply analyzing the situation, the demographic situation, the situation with the domestic labor market, and we need to look for the stimuli, the incentives that will see our migrants returning to the country. And we also need to try and make sure that these incentives are rational and justified. And I think we need to consider very much the European experience as part of the previous migration waves. I guess we shouldn't be speaking about the previous migration crisis that had to do with refugees from Syria, first of all. I think the more relevant are the migration processes that took place as a result of the Balkan Wars in the 90s. And we should also be looking at the migration flows that had to do with the opening of the European labor market to Central and Eastern European countries, the newly acceded countries. They have been mentioned several times throughout the discussion today. We should be looking at some of the positive and negative examples and experiences from those episodes, and we should be learning from them. Here, I wanted to also quickly reflect and provide some feedback to what Ms. Libanova said. The Baltic countries experienced serious demographic losses, she pointed out, and this applies not only to Baltic countries, but also to Bulgaria, Romania, Poland itself. But what I want to point out right now is that integration into the EU labor market, their integration into the EU economy, has led to the situation that these countries actually converged very strongly to a level comparable with the older members of the EU. So I think we should be looking at both the positive and negative moments. So migration from Central and Eastern European countries into older European countries. With that happening, there was also the reverse process of businesses and investors migrating into Central and Eastern Europe, and productivity grew very much through skills exchanges, experience exchanges, knowledge exchange, and through their integration from a technological point of view into the same area as the older EU countries. And migration also reflected this process. So in this sense, I believe we have quite a significant playground to work with. We need to be looking into all the processes that are experienced by our compatriots. They also, the Ukrainians abroad learn new skills and become developed as professionals during their stay in Europe. If we talk about the recommendations that Dariia reflected on her slide, which Oleksii quite commented in a lot of detail, as well as Ella Marlenivna. I think this has not been pointed out on the slide, but there's a bit of an elephant in the room, the real factor that will in many ways determine the situation with returnees and the further development of the safety risk situation. I mean, this was reflected, of course, in the survey results. There's still the issue of safety, right? That is what forces and makes our compatriots stay abroad. And the figures for Western Ukraine, for example, I mean, the safety risks there are sort of lower than for the rest of the country, but for many Ukrainian women, the choice is between either returning to areas that are in direct proximity to the theater of military action or are occupied. So internally displaced person, or the alternative to that is them being IDPs, internally displaced persons. And so when making this decision, they also consider the economic motives, the economic factors. Obviously, in certain countries such as Germany or other EU members, the level of social support that they will enjoy is certainly going to be much more generous than what they can expect to have in Ukraine, regardless of all the programs that the Ukrainian government is trying to implement. If we speak about the economic incentives that were reflected in the slide and the recommendations, I want to say that it is my deep conviction that we have to look for opportunities to provide Ukrainian citizens, both IDPs and refugees, with opportunities for employment. I mean, this is the key factor that will make people return to Ukraine. Because the importance of being able to provide yourself with a dignified standard of living, it's obviously at the very forefront of their thoughts. It obviously impacts the kinds of future that they will be able to imagine for themselves. Being able to earn a decent wage is a top priority. And so in view of this, the economic recovery programs that we keep talking about I believe they really need to take into account this internal domestic localization process. They need to take into account where people are residing right now, where we want them to reside after the war ends, and they need to be lucrative. Another aspect I want to turn our attention to is that when economic policy measures aimed at stimulating people to return to Ukraine are developed, specifically if we're talking about competing for labor resources, the competition between labor resources labor resources between the EU and Ukraine, we need to be aware of the fact that the physical location of the employee is not that important anymore. It has been touched upon in the course of the presentation. I think Oleksii pointed out that many Ukrainians abroad continue working for Ukrainian companies, even for state-owned companies, and thus they contribute to Ukraine's GDP, although physically they are not in the country. Although, of course, with their consumer expenses, these people are stimulating the economy of whichever host country they are in right now. The situation was the same before the war. I mean, very often our people would be physically located in Ukraine, but they would be contributed to the GDP of a foreign country, working for, say, your classic example, an outsourced IT company. So I'm sure this aspect must be taken into account when relevant decisions are made. And finally, I would like to mention that, in my opinion, the labor market, its analysis and research of it, even before the war, was quite a lacking element. I mean, if you compare Ukraine to many other countries, we are lacking a good amount of data. The data on unemployment and many other important indicators lagged behind from the current moment. It appeared with a great deal of time lag, so it was difficult to build economic policy for this sphere in a justified, data-based way. Now, considering the challenges that we are facing and the opportunities, the need for relevant analysis, the opportunity of using alternative data, I am sure that we need to continue bringing together our efforts. We need to continue looking for opportunities to deeply dive into demographic processes, into the processes of the labor markets operation. So I would once again like to reiterate that the National Bank is very much open to this cooperation. We are very happy to share the data that we have. First of all, I'm talking about data that we can obtain from the bank payments systems. Perhaps there are any other ideas on how we can contribute productively. Let me just reassure you that this is a relevant topic from our point of view, and we're happy to allocate our human resources and to share the data that we have at our disposal to try and address the issues, to help address the issues that are faced by the government. Thank you so much, Sergiy. And we even have one recommendation formulated in the chat that we unfortunately missed, although we worked with the Ministry of Social Policy. I mean, there's the issue of taxation applied to Ukrainians abroad. This is a topic where the government can really play an important role. And Oleksii, I think you, as the deputy for digital transformation in your environment of digital experts, you might raise this issue because with the Ministry of Finance, It's an important issue to discuss with them. When the relations between governments are regulated by double taxation agreements, we need to try and establish the best possible conditions for Ukrainian refugees so that they receive necessary notices from the tax service about taxes paid in Ukraine, so that they are able to avoid double taxation, so that they don't find themselves in a situation where a Ukrainian has to pay all their taxes in, let's say, Poland after the same taxes have been paid in Ukraine. And then you start going through the bureaucracy. You have to go to this office and that office, and suddenly the person doesn't feel incentivized to work for their Ukrainian employer anymore, and they want to get employed in their host country. So this once again stresses the multifaceted nature of this issue and the need to tackle it comprehensively. So Dariia, apart from this issue that we will have to take into account and that we will have to elaborate on in our final report, what would be your comments and what are the next steps and the plans? Yes, thank you very much, Hlib. I will not be taking a lot of time at this point. I want to use this opportunity to thank once again all of the speakers who have contributed very productively. Our plan is to take into account the comments that we received from people as part of this discussion, or if you feel like reading the big version of the report, I'll be very grateful for your feedback. Please refer to the website of the CES to acquaint yourself with the big report. We've shared the link in the chat already. Another big plan that we have for improving the results is to hold the second wave of the survey this spring. So we will send out the survey link to the same respondents. We will invite them once more to participate, and we will see how many of them have stayed abroad, how many of them have returned to Ukraine, and we will see whether they've introduced any changes to their plans after the war, for example. I'm pretty sure we're going to see some interesting dynamics. A lot has taken place, a lot has happened since last fall when we had the survey before. So there have been blackouts in the country, there have been changes to the front lines and to activity, there have been changes to certain European rules applying to Ukrainians. Right now, the end of the period, the end of the first year of temporary protection is coming to an end, and different countries have different rules for how the status is prolonged. So it'll be interesting to see whether this factor contributes to the Ukrainians' plans. We will look at all of this as part of the second wave, and then we will have a similar presentation for this final version of the survey that will then be enriched by additional data. Yes, and we'll think about the best format to present the second wave, because the issue is indeed very comprehensive, very multifaceted. Perhaps it makes sense to have separate events for separate aspects. I am incredibly grateful to Dariia and to Olga for presenting for the research and the survey. Thank you to the National Bank for their cooperation in preparing today's event. Thank you to Oleksii, to Ella Marlenyevna, and to Sergiy for participating. Thank you so much to our interpreter, who has steadily stood their ground and survived this 2-hour conversation. As Dariia has pointed out, we'll be very happy to receive your feedback, and we will make sure to take it into account when we tackle the second wave, and whatever helps improve this study. We want to make sure that we provide a good product so that our government colleagues are then able to take the right policy decisions and work for the benefit of Ukraine's development. Thank you so much. Have a